Hi everybody, my name is Jun. I'm one of the events coordinators here at Shelf Life Books. First off, I would like to request that you keep yourself muted. I see that you all are right now because I muted all of you. We are recording this event, so I encourage you to turn off your cameras as well if that makes you feel uncomfortable. We're very, very excited to be launching this beautiful book here, Barcode Poetry by Kyle Flemmer, who happens to be the other events coordinator here, my coworker and friend. Kyle, we are very proud of you for putting together such an exquisite volume. We do have copies of the book here in store. You can pick one up at www.shelflifebooks.ca, or you can just come down and pay us a visit. You can also purchase a copy along with many other lovely publications at www.theblastedtree.com. Before we get started, I'd like to say that we at Shelf Life Books acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Treaty 7 people. That's the Blackfoot from Siksika, the Gaina and the Bigani, the Denisarsi from Tsutena, and the Stoney Nakoda from Morley, the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. We also walk in the footsteps of the Métis people from Region 3, the Métis Nation of Alberta. Okay, I've been asked to keep this short, so I'm going to pass this off to Kyle straight away. Kyle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thanks everybody for showing up this evening. I really appreciate it. I'm super excited about this. It's been like it seems like years in the making, and like this is like the payoff at the end. And I'm very grateful to see all these friendly faces here. Yeah, I'm joined this evening to launch my first book by a couple wonderful local visual poets, Katie O'Brien and Kevin Stebner. And before we get too far into it, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about the three of us. Let's start with them. Kevin Stebner is an artist, poet, and musician from Calgary. He produces installation art using old video game gear, creates concrete pieces with his typewriter, and is active in various music projects, including GreyScreen, Fulfilment, Cold Water, and No False Suns. Kevin is also the proprietor of Calgary's best bookstore that's in a shed, Shed Books. I've had the pleasure of publishing a few things by Kevin, most recently this chapbook, The Unfolding. Unfortunately, it's no longer available for purchase as a chapbook, but you can see it online on the Blasted Trees website if you're interested in his work. I'm sure you will be. Tonight, we're also joined by Katie O'Brien, who is a poet, community worker, queer activist, and Netflix enthusiast, originally from St. John's, Takamak on unceded Beothuk land. They currently live in Mohkinstsis on Treaty 7 territory and recently founded Blood Orange, an experimental poetry tarot. Katie dislikes lying, sings a lot, and doesn't kill bugs. I've also had the pleasure of publishing some of Katie's work. Maybe 2 years ago now, we released A Peal of Thunder, A Moment Of, which is a wonderful visual poetry chapbook. I'm sure you'll see some of that this evening as well. I don't actually know everybody here, which is very exciting. And so maybe I should tell you a little bit about myself too. My name is Kyle. I'm currently a master's student at the University of Calgary, where I'm studying digital poetics. I founded The Blasted Tree in 2014, 7 years ago already, which has just flown by. We focus on publishing experimental visual poetry, or experimental poetry and visual poetry, fiction, short fiction, all sorts of stuff. We have like comics coming out, we've published plays, all sorts of things. So if you're into like the weird and wonderful of small press publishing, please do stop by the website. There's so much amazing work that isn't mine. But I guess the occasion this evening is actually something of mine, which is barcode poetry. This book I started in, 2016. Like in the fall, I was moving into an apartment with my wife Marley. The internet wasn't hooked up yet. I was like, it was 17 hours without the internet, and I was super bored already. So I popped out the typewriter and I started just monkeying around with using the craft paper that was left over from moving. And I made something that kind of looked like a barcode. And the next thing that I made was the first barcode poem. And yeah, it's been a long time in the making. It's involved a ton of people as like beta readers and editors. And I wrote an afterword for it and had like a bunch of people read that as well. Some of whom are here. The most useful of whom are definitely here. And yeah, I think that's probably enough blabber about why we're all here this evening. So the format I think we should pursue is a bit of like a show and tell sort of thing. So each of us will take a few minutes to show some work, maybe talk about the projects that we've done in the past, or maybe what we have coming up. And then the three of us will sort of have a roundtable discussion about visual poetry. I'm always surprised that people are so like, they back away from visual poetry, because I find it so like inviting, and I want to try and share some of that energy with you tonight. And then I'd like, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, or later unmute yourself and ask away, and we'll be happy to address anything. So first this evening, I believe Katie O'Brien is going to show us some work. Katie, are you ready to do that?
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Awesome. Well, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. For folks who can't see me, I'll just do a visual description. So my name is Katie. I use they, them pronouns. I am a white settler person with short curly brown hair, wearing fabulous blueberry earrings from Indus-City, and this like colorless sweater. I don't even know what this color is, but I'm really enjoying it right now. And I am sitting in my study with bookshelf behind me with a uterus plushie on it, which I like to point out. And I'm excited to share some of my work with you today. Kevin and Kyle and I were talking a little bit before folks showed up about how communities are like kind of disparate in visual poetry, and folks come to this kind of art form very differently. And so it's exciting to me that we're all here sharing. One of like the upsides of Zoom, I guess, is that we can kind of share visual poetry in a way that you can't really do in person. So, all right, here we go. So I hope that everyone can see this screen share, first of all. My entry into visual poetry started before I knew what visual poetry was. I want to say I was like in junior high school, and I doodled a lot, generally on like the margins of my social studies notes, like writing people's names, crushes' names over and over and over again, so that they were kind of blurred out as like a black ink blotch that nobody could decipher names of, as a way, I think, of kind of protecting my queerness, a way of having something that was just for me, but also like that repetition was really helpful in a lot of ways. And so I have continued doing this like weird doodly writing things on top of each other since then, probably. And a couple of years ago, I started doing the same thing with musical notation. So I think this was the first real, like legit visual poem that I made, that you see on the screen here. And the thing that really inspired this particular piece was this kind of floating piece of notation in the like top right that's not connected to any of the notes. And so it's actually just like an incorrect piece of music that I thought this like was beautiful, flowing, and tried to kind of replicate that in layering the music on top of itself, so that you can kind of see this like wave throughout the piece. Yeah, I don't really know what else people would like me to say about these pieces, but I'm just going to kind of blab while you can look at them. So this was the beginning. All of the work that I'm going to show you tonight is from Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which is a piece that's really near and dear to my heart. Strangely, I'm not really sure like how this happened, but when my grandmother was dying, as I was a teenager, I was listening to this piece and knew somehow that she had passed away, even though I was in Mohkinstsis and she was in St. John's. So I feel this connection between Beethoven and my grandmother that's kind of helped me create this project of like taking all of this music from the Moonlight Sonata and processing it through visual poetry as a way of kind of honoring her memory, honoring my grief, and like trying new things, really playing around with visual poetry. And so this was another of the early pieces that I made. Both of these are in the chapbook that Kyle published with Blasted Tree. And one of the things that I love about this one is like, you can still very much tell that it's music, but it's more opaque than the first piece that I showed you. And I really enjoyed the kind of weird symmetry of it as well. This piece I call Clatter. It's been published in a chapbook that Rob McLennan published just over a year ago, I think now. And I just love the way that it feels like it's falling off the page. It's one of kind of the more playful pieces that I've started making. And one of the things that I love about making these poems is I don't sit down and have like really like academic intellectualize before I make a piece. I just kind of like play around on Word, really. Like it's really not high tech, and try and like layer things on top of each other in ways that are kind of visually appealing and interesting. So if you're wondering about poetic process, mine is, there is not really much of one. I just make a thing that I think is cool. This piece, the fermata, or the kind of half circle with a dot in it in music, indicates pausing on a particular note or beat. And so what I really found interesting about like playing with the fermata is, okay, how long can you pause on something? And I think that that sense of pause comes across in this piece, even if you don't read music, even if you don't kind of recognize what the musical notation means, or at least that's what I hope. So this is a simpler piece that I've been kind of playing around with for probably a year, trying to kind of get away a little bit from the super opaque layering and seeing what happens if I create a little bit more breathing room in poetry. And so we'll see if this turns into something that gets published. But I am trying to experiment a little bit with the interplay between like the heavier, really ink blot-y pieces and more kind of playful or whimsical, or like ways of playing with musical notation that is still impossible to play, but looks a little bit more like music. And then the last piece that I wanted to share today is this piece. So the double Fs at the end in musical notation, it's called a Fortissimo, which is like the loudest dynamic that you can play or sing in a musical piece. And what I love about this particular poem is that the Fortissimo is over a rest, or a place where there is actually no notes to be played. And I think that's part of what I love about this kind of style, is that of poetry, is that it can evoke feeling the same way that music can evoke feeling without actually having words to describe, like, what does it mean to have a really loud rest? Which I think ties back into the way that I've been using visual poetry as a mechanism to kind of explore my grief. So that's what I've got for all of you today. I hope that those were interesting, that my strange musings on my kind of poetry, kind of not quite poetry practice have been exciting. Yeah. Kevin, would you like to go next?
Sure. Thanks, Katie. My forays into concrete poetry actually essentially have existed solely through the pandemic. Right before everything dropped, a friend of mine gifted me a typewriter. He's kind of someone who scours electronic recycling bins for old video game gear, but he found a typewriter in it, and he's like, oh, he brought it over. And that was actually like the object itself that began all this work I've been doing. And over the pandemic, I've been near almost every day I've made a piece. So I've been like, over the last little bit, I've made over 300 pieces. And you'll kind of see some of the advanced things I've gotten to over the next little bit. So why don't I start with something like this guy. So this is a piece called Shelted. It's kind of a curious, like you might notice in a lot of my pieces, even though using a typewriter, you have this vast array of keys that you can use. But you may notice that I've largely used forward slashes and underlines. So it might not be obviously apparent, but and so it's even like I approach a lot of typewriter stuff almost as like an Olympian constraint, but seeing what you can do with just these two keys. And so there's things that I do with everything else, but even just I'm still exploring the underline and the forward slash. So I'm trying to do a lot of work that explores depth within concrete poetry. I want pieces that go into the page, because I often find that a lot of visual work is very flat. And so the page itself obviously is a two-dimensional form, but seeing ways in which, depth can interact in the page as well. So I was kind of fascinated with especially like the Mallarmé piece, like the toss of the dice, because I think that was kind of the first piece I've ever seen that actually had a three-dimensional element on the page. And so I wanted to kind of do a lot of exploring with that in what I'm doing. So a piece like this not only is exploring depth, but also trying to do a little visual trickery as well. One thing that I've also been fascinated with is kind of like flow in these pieces as well. So I kind of explore a lot of themes of running water, especially in the book, the unfolding that I did with Kyle and Blasted Tree. There is a lot of ideas of like water flowing. And so using like very rigid forms of like type, and then like trying to make them have like liquid life to them. Within that, I've been speaking to just kind of like using those limited forms and what you can do with just, in this case, underlines and periods. This one was like I wanted to like evoke like an embrace of some kind, but using just periods and underlines. This one will be coming out in a book very soon as well. And so speaking to kind of depth and form, this is a recent favorite that I'm like quite proud of, that utilizes negative space in like a 3D form. So this one was trying to evoke like the cloud cover of around Mount Fuji, so the Kasagumo clouds, and so using those clouds in particular. So these pieces in particular are like definitely veer more towards like the visual, like composed side more than a kind of poetic or narrative side. So these ones are ones that like I've largely have begun as ideas, and then they were drawn and explored, or attempted to be drawn and explored, but then I made them on the typewriter. And kind of one of the reasons that I use the typewriter as my tool is because I never had the ability as a visual artist to do make my brain or my hand do what my brain saw. There was always that disconnect. And so having the tool like a typewriter actually allowed me to do those things. I think I've talked to Kyle about this before, but I approached the typewriter very similarly to the way I see pixel art, because the typewriter itself is actually like a pixel. It's like a pixelated grid. Everything is like a certain square with the exact amount of spacing every time. And so most of the pieces I do, I see them within that like very rigid style, and you build them like one tiny square at a time. And so that was kind of one of the reasons that I've actually, like, the rigidity of it was actually quite freeing to me. So these ones have all been like kind of composed, but that's not to say that everything I do is in that form. So I'll kind of give you a more recent one. I just published this. I self-published this as a newspaper. So those other ones were kind of on my one of my favorite typewriters, the Remington. But I've got another typewriter that is a very wide carriage that they were originally made to do like bookkeeping. So you could like actually spread a book out like a big two-page binder out, and you could type on it. So this one in particular, originally done on 11 by 17 pages. So this actually allowed me to go much larger. And these ones kind of very much came about from having that extra space to move around and do them. And these ones just spilled out. I let them spill out. These ones weren't composed or planned prior. And they kind of have they're a lot more messy. And generally I kind of dislike the haphazard messiness of a lot of things, but then this one I kind of just let it happen. And yeah, this one was so the newspaper itself is sort of these four structured, kind of based on around very similar to kind of a play on the way Stephen McCaffrey's Carnival kind of ties into each other, sort of ways he uses, typewriters and stamps, but I kind of had these number of pages that allowed them to fit together in a sort of a puzzle-like form. I'll end with one more last piece. Hopefully, hear this. So even this was just trying to be as limited as possible, seeing what I could do with just an underline and using paper shift. So this one was definitely trying to move away from like the rigidity of the grid form and typing with the braces off. And so allowing yourself to do a lot more paper shift and over typing and things like that. Yeah. Hopefully that piqued some of your interest. I definitely would, if there's any kind of questions about things, I think I would do well with that as well. So, but I just wanted to show you a couple of more recent kind of trying to find ways to, to show you how you can stretch the ability of what a typewriter can do. So I've definitely been trying to use this time to stretch the boundaries of what typewriters could be. So hopefully I've done something. Yeah. Thank you. Kyle, you want to take over?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you so much, Kevin. Do you mind if I take over the screen share? Awesome. Thanks both of you for showing us your work. It's fascinating and very thrilling just to see what other visual poets are doing sort of behind the veil. Not so much of it makes it out into the mainstream. So yeah, you guys are both wonderful. I think to start off with, I'm going to show you some of my stuff from Barcode Poetry. As I said before, I started it just almost accidentally after we moved, and I didn't have anything really to play with besides my typewriter. And it's a typewriter I got from my grandfather. I don't even know how long ago now, half a lifetime ago. And my father-in-law had it serviced, so I was able to start using it about 10 years ago. And oh, a little less than that, 8 or 9 years ago. And quickly started using it for spacing it out and making it float around. Now, the barcode stuff was the first time I had sort of accidentally or like playfully come across a new poetic form that I wanted to pursue. And because it looks like a barcode, I thought it would be funny to make jokes about capitalism and consumerism and pop culture. And as I went along, I started making more jokes about like creative writing, because if you go to like a creative writing workshop, there's all sorts of like cliches or lessons that everybody sort of gets, like kill your darlings is a really good one. Your most prized line that you are most attached to is probably the one that sucks, and you should edit it out. I think that's a really funny and curious piece of advice. I don't think it's right at all. Like you're probably able to assess which is your best line and which isn't on your own. Or having somebody be like, throw out your most favorite thing, it's silly. So I wanted to take all of these sort of flavors and bring them together. I've been sharing these barcodes on Instagram for the last, I guess it's like 77 days now. So I'm going to start at the end and move back, because I started at the beginning. So hopefully there's some stuff in here that maybe you haven't seen before. Poem is made up of 14 lines, repeated, and then it has the code at the bottom there. And the code is made up of the number of letters in each column makes the number under each column, and the 2 at the front indicate which group of 10 it's part of. So this is the 100th, the 10th group of 10, so 100, and this is the sequence in the whole series. So this is, 10th group, 0th poem, it's number 100. The cool thing about these poems is that each one, as I made them, I wanted to make sure that the code was unique, even without like the 2 thing. And so I was tracking them in the spreadsheet, and every time I edited a poem, I would make a little change in my spreadsheet, and every time I added a new one, I would compare it against these numbers to make sure that there were no duplicate entries. And that didn't even happen once. Like, this is such a surprisingly robust system that like it didn't even come close to duplicating a number. A lot of that is helped by splitting up words like this. This creates a whole bunch of like artificial ones that wouldn't necessarily be in there if I just didn't split up the word. And when I started doing this, I realized I can really emphasize particular words. I can really emphasize the barcode form. And it became one of my, I guess, favorite techniques for this series. Yeah. I have been thinking about how to do a reading of these poems for a long time, because as I was writing this, it never occurred to me that I'd be able to have a virtual book launch and do a screen share and just show you and let you read them on your own. And so for years, I've been thinking about, well, do I just get up on stage and like read one line, or do I read it 14 times over? Which would, I think, kind of be funny and really hit the nail on the head if you just read the same the same line over and over again. But I'm rather pleased that I can just flip through these here, and we'll look at like 20, and I want to show you a different project, 2 different projects, all of which I consider to be visual sonnets. So a sonnet, much like these barcodes, has 14 lines. It's one of the clearest rule about sonnets. I'd like to say that every rule about poetry can be broken, obviously, and that's what a lot of what experimental poetry is doing. But really, all for a sonnet, mostly what you need is 14 lines, and I just sort of happen to have that already here. So this idea of something can look like a sonnet without being the traditional Shakespearean sonnet with a rhyme structure or with like a specific meter, so like stressed and unstressed syllables, you know, the kind of thing that you'd think of very much from a Shakespeare play, has that classical feel and rhythm to it. This visual stuff here, I think, is obviously approaching sonnets from a very different perspective. Sonnet comes from the word sonata, which is like, it's Italian for sound, or it's a root of the word sound. And so there's a little bit of irony in trying to make visual sonnets. You're trying to make something visual out of a sonic structure. But given that it's already written on the page, and given that it already sort of has this structure on the page, I want to argue that even a sonnet that isn't designed to be visual already has that element of visualness to it. So when you go to school, they teach you that a sonnet has 14 lines, and that it has a rhyme pattern, and that it is broken into stanzas, maybe of 6 lines or 4 lines, or maybe it has couplets in it. And so you start to feel like the be all end all of a sonnet is its form, or maybe perhaps the rhyme. We're all really familiar with the Hallmark rhyming poem, right? Like that kind of has a bit of a sonnet flair to it, at least to my ear. I'm more interested in how a sonnet presents like a question or addresses a topic, and then introduces like a twist or solves this problem in a novel, unique way. And when people break up their sonnets into chunks of lines, stanzas, like 6 lines, 4 lines, 2 lines, 4 lines to get the 14, they're thinking about how they're going to flow through their ideas. So for me, the most important part of a sonnet is how this line of thinking is carried through the poem, and more importantly, how your line of thinking is structured by the lines of the poem. And the word line is a graphic word, and so this has led me into all sorts of other forms of visual sonnets. This next project is called Correctional Sonnets, because I made the whole thing using correctional fluid of 3 different kinds. The first is like the liquid brush on kind that we all had when we were kids. I use the pen type, so it's very accurate, and then also the tape kind that you press down. And so notice right away that this similarly has the 14-line structure. This is part of a series of which there are 10 sonnets, each of which has interlinking first and last lines. So this, sorry, my mistake, there's 15 sonnets. Because there are 14 of the linkages, the 15th sonnet actually documents all the first lines of each poem, and it is called a crown of sonnets, a heroic crown. So with this project, I was experimenting with how can a line, just simply like a literal line, communicate the different formal structures of a sonnet. For instance, let's look at a good one with this one has like 2 really striking lines right at the end here. Shakespeare would use 2 a really striking couplet at the end of a sonnet to like just really drive a point home. That is the conclusion right there. And so you have like this setup 4, you have the middle 4, you have maybe like it's kind of change the tone here, and then you really slam it home at the end. Like there's an Italian structure that does it totally different. There are modern structures that don't use any sort of formal divisions like this. And so this project is really about, yeah, trying to suggest the various possibilities of a sonnet just with correctional fluid. The other side of this is there's like a great tradition of erasure poetry, which is you take an existing text and you maybe black out some of the words or most of the words, and just whatever's left constitutes a new found poem. So using correctional fluid, this substance that you would normally erase text with to build the structure, is meant to draw your attention to the structure absent of words. So it does sort of invoke that erasure without anything really needing to be there in the first place. Let's show you the last one here is called this is the Master Sonnet. So this has the first line of each sonnet, the 14 sonnets preceding it. So it's kind of the key to the rest of them. And then just for a little fun, I animated all 15 together. Gives it like a really nice, you really get the sort of shapeliness of each one when they float past you like this. Finally, I want to show you something totally different that I made using star charts. And this one is called Coronagraphic. It's also a crown of sonnets. So these are all interlinked as well, where the first line, which in this case is actually a square, is the last one is the first of the next one. You can see that they're the same there. Now, this one is a bit of a stretch to call it a visual sonnet. At least in conversation with other people, I have found this one to encounter the most obstacles. So the idea behind this is I had a spreadsheet automatically generate coordinates in the sky using these formulas. So there's a random between this range, and every time you reload the spreadsheet, it generates new coordinates. My line of thinking is that each coordinate in the night sky is actually a line of sight between the observer and the star or the region of space that they're observing. So if I could generate a coordinate, I could then go and look it up in my book of star charts, which is just one of the most gorgeous objects that I own. Like, it's stunning. I generated all these interlinked sets when I found the page number for each of those coordinates, and then copied. Oh, I'll show you what it looks like. Copied each individual region in the grid that would contain that coordinate. And so each of these regions is like a little window into space that corresponds to one line in my spreadsheet, which is a line of sight. So for me, this is a line. This is a line in a poem, a visual poem, specifically because it invokes sight. The other side of it is that all these coordinates are distributed around the entire night sky. It would be impossible for a single person to go and view any one of these sonnets in order or at any one time. Like, you don't just look up and go 1, 2, 3, 4, there's all my lines. The only way to achieve a reading of this poem is on a global scale. Just as the only way that we made these star charts in the first place is with hundreds and hundreds of astronomers who worked at it for hundreds and hundreds of years. These star chart books that I have are like what I understand to be the cumulative knowledge of like human astrological mapping. So like it is a totem of our place in the universe as a species. And so I wanted my poems to really elude the individual. I wanted them to be a communal project. I can't imagine anything more beautiful than like 14 people going out and looking at the night sky into these different coordinates at the same time and being like, we are experiencing this poem together. Anyways, 14 of those lines, sight lines, come together to create a grid like this with one missing space. I randomly generated that missing space as well to give each of the poems a bit of personality. And also because, as I mentioned with the correctional fluid poems, the way that they're structured, the breaks and the pauses play a lot into the meaning of the poem or the significance of the structure. So I'm just going to flip through these 10. You can have a little bit of a look at some of the different objects that appear. I'm really interested in graphical notation, how this constitutes a form of reading, even though there's very little in the way of letters. Like the legend on a map is a kind of alphabet in a way. And the legend is what teaches you how to read and understand the map. Just like the musical notation that Katie's working with is another form of writing, another form of notation or reading. Like we're all comfortable with the idea of reading music or reading a map. When you scramble it up and make it more challenging, make it more frustrating to interpret, it's nonetheless an act of reading. And for me, that makes it visual poetry. That pretty much takes me through everything that I wanted to show you this evening. And I think that ends on a nice, very nice, like vague discussion point for what is or isn't visual poetry. So I guess at this point, I'm gonna close down my screen share, and that is, I think, the question I want to table for Katie and Kevin for us to get started. Just what the hell is visual poetry? It's seriously a question I get asked all the time. I'm not surprised about it or poo-pooing on people who don't have an answer to that. It's a tricky one to nail down, but let's put it out there. What's visual poetry?
Just like a really casual, small question to start out with. Hey.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the definition is like you're using topographical elements in some artistic form. But that could be defined anything. So what actually makes it a poem is you as the poet defining it as such. Well, and I thought that was something interesting you're saying, Kyle, because you said, like, I never saw what you were doing as sonnets until like just now you said as much. Like I've been through your manuscript, you know, five times, and I never actually it did not occur to me that they were sonnets. So it's almost like maybe this is the question, do you, in framing them as sonnets, does you think that legitimizes them as poems?
I think that's certainly part of it. Yeah, it's certainly part of it. That's the long and the short of like found art, is it not? You know, someone sees something and tosses a frame around it and goes, look, that's art. It's mostly their agency that's making that happen. But there's also the other side of art is it has an audience, and it takes somebody else to look at it and go, correct, I agree, that is art. I am moved, or whatever, right? Or someone tosses a frame around something and goes, hey, that's art. I don't necessarily need to go, I agree with you just because they've done it, right? I do feel like when I qualify my work as a sonnet, or even visual poetry as poetry, I'm making something of a sales pitch, that I'm entering a negotiation or into a negotiation with the other person. And maybe we'll find some common ground in our understanding of what it is.
I wonder too about, I'm sure like people who are more immersed in visual and concrete poetry circles will have better answers to this than I do, but like, is there something about visual poetry as tangible or like more inviting, as you said, Kyle, than kind of your traditional Shakespearean sonnets that for a lot of high schoolers, for example, feel very inaccessible? And I guess I'm also asking about is there a difference between concrete poetry and visual poetry, or are they different ways of describing similar practices?
Well, I think that there's like a definition, there's a difference in definition, and I think that there are people who are invested in those definitions probably more so than I am. Like I've heard the term VisPo sort of is not acceptable because it seems so flippant or juvenile, or maybe it's putting the visual and the poetic aspect on too much of a level, like the word itself is formed on an equal basis, when really poetry should take preference because it's a more noble pursuit of art or something like that. So I think that there are definitely differences. I don't really use them. I'm happy to use any of those labels, to be honest.
I'm the exact same way, because I think if you start to get pedantic about those things, then just kind of the freedom of you creating a beautiful object is totally lost or is diminished in some manner. So the answer is it's not important what the difference
The answer is bad question.
No, it's not a bad question. It's a good question because you're asking how you situate your work in the larger discussion.
Mhm.
And I guess my answer to that is that the larger discussion has some preconceived notions about what's what that were formed before I came, and I haven't necessarily adopted all of them.
Mhm.
That's true. Katie, to what you were saying about, like you said that you thought that, you know, like high schoolers find visual poetry more inviting than, say, a Shakespearean sonnet, which is interesting because in the publishing world, that's the exact opposite. It's much
Totally.
easier to find a home for a poem than, or, you know, a written, structured flagpole along the left side poem, much easier than, you know, a mashing of letters or what have you. So
Mhm.
it's interesting that, like, okay, maybe like someone who has no experience with a poem, like what are they actually gravitating towards? Could be the visual element a lot more, but it's interesting that as we grow and gain more books, that somehow the exact opposite happens.
Mhm.
I don't know.
I feel like some of that has to do with like kind of this punk vibe almost of lots of visual poetry that's like, no, I'm gonna just do a thing that I want to do, and it's not going to have a form, or I'm going to create a form for it that isn't like recognized. That's like really challenging for kind of traditional publishing to accept, which is why you get really brilliant kind of independent publishers like Blaster Tree and like Rob McLennan is like the person who introduces lots of folks to.
Well, especially immersed, like being on Instagram and then just like meeting all these people across the world. I mean, Instagram is like a really great form for dispersing visual poetry. I know all three of us do that, and it's allowed us to like be connected with all these people across oceans.
Mhm.
But speaking to that idea, that notion of punk, that's actually the thing that like was so gratifying to me publishing a lot of this work over the last year and a half, is that everyone who's involved in it is a punk, even if they've never listened to a punk song in their life. They're still people who have ingrained DIY ethics, and it was really gratifying to find another scene like that at this time for myself.
Well, so
I don't know.
I think I saw Kate Siklosi in the audience here, and her work is like so punk rock while being so like tender and beautiful and fragile. Like it's this amazing combination of exactly what it is Kevin's addressing.
But and then I found that all across the world, every country has one person who does that very thing. But somehow Canada has like 5. So
visual poetry scene in particular, really strong small press scene, and it's spread coast to coast. If you are interested I say this to the audience more generally, if you are interested in like the grassroots of poetry, there's a small press map that actually Kate Sikosi put together with Gapright Press that has like a list of everybody coast to coast that's publishing cool stuff. And if you're making things, or if you're interested in picking up like leaflets and chapbooks and stuff you can't generally find in stores, that's an awesome resource, a great place to start.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's so cool. It's like a piece of visual poetry in and of itself, that kind of map. Yeah.
I wonder, I don't have like an eye on the chat here, if there's any questions floating around that we should address.
There was a question from Sarah, I want to say. I would love to hear about process of creation, tools, etc. So we wanted to talk about that sort of thing. Honestly, my process of creation is like open up Word and throw on like Drag Race in the background and tinker. Like there's no process.
I will say that I approach these things, like my text poetry is it takes me ages to write a single poem, because like I have an idea of what I want and I try every word that occurs to me in every possible space until I get it. But visual poetry is so much more free. That said, I approach it like, I kind of approach it like a scientist, and it's like, what are the chemicals in my toolkit here? How can I combine them? And then how they react, that's the surprise. That's the result. Sometimes they don't bubble away the way that you think that they would, or not at all, or you find something totally new.
For myself, I think boredom is an incredible factor that plays into artistic creation, especially during this year and a half and being locked inside. Being like free of those distractions and only thinking about, you know, what like the form of that you're creating in front of you, having that to simply like nothing else is affecting it other than your own process, just creating something in that sense. I've definitely found that, like, yeah, that boredom and like quietness has really helped to, like, I think I should have exhausted what I'm doing with a typewriter, but I've made 300 pieces and I'm still like finding a new thing to tweak and explore, and it just comes from like looking at something so closely and just like seeing at it, and things like just like geometric forms, something that I've like been taken with, even just putting 2 lines together and just seeing like how to build off of that. Yeah,
I think there's something. Oh, sorry, go for it,
no,
Kevin.
all done.
Okay, I was just going to say, I think there's something about, I feel a lot like my visual poetry practice is about like hacking existing forms of media. So taking a piece of musical notation that somebody else has written and turning that into a visual poem. So my friend Anuradha is in the audience, and she messaged saying that some of my poems remind her of collage, and really sometimes that's what it feels like, is I'm taking, you know, media that exists outside, of my own brain and then like imprinting my brain onto it, if that makes sense. So I think it's really interesting that for both Kevin's typewriter work and Kyle, some of your work around the barcode poetry series, that you're not using external work or like mapping external work onto your poetry. That sounds
I don't think
way harder than my
yeah.
than my work.
I definitely don't think that's true. I think like everything, it's just like, some artist did a structure like this, like, can I make that on a typewriter? Or I think it's definitely like every little thing you see can be an inspiration. So I like trying to work like in your head, I think, is a difficulty, but yeah, and steal and get inspired by whatever you see.
Yeah, I'm a totally different artistic practice. I make a bunch of like homebrew memes that I share in like group chats. And the philosophy there is like steal as much as you can, pile it on top of each other, rearrange it, erase people's watermarks, like whatever you got to do, just like make it. It's like this orgy of creativity where the individual's stamp on it counts for like very little. And some of that energy is, I think, really useful in more rigid creative spaces, and has led to beautiful collage work and a lot of what we're doing. Katie and I have been talking about a collaborative project for ages.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly we were just playing around with different forms of like applications online that use graphical notation, and how you can sort of bend them to make fun shapes, right? And it doesn't have to be anything serious. It can just be, what tools do you have at hand and how much time do I have to monkey around with them and go.
Yeah, and I think like coming back to that question of what is visual poetry to begin with, that piece of like, here's a form of language, whether it be graphical notation, like musical notation, some other kind of mapping, and treating it as reading, as you were saying, Kyle, and finding ways to make it like more complicated to read or to express something different than what you would originally think that that kind of notation would express, I think is my main piece around visual poetry.
And kind of just speaking broadly to creative process in general, my advice definitely goes against the advice of kind of like most writing guides and just being like, oh, make sure you like are working on your writing every day and that kind of thing. And I think that's actually pretty detrimental, because you'll start beating your head against a wall when you get stuck. My true advice is to just be interested in a ton of things and have lots of creative projects. So like play music, have like 4 different writing projects, have like make videos, do anything. So it's just having a thing. So when you are burned out or uninspired on your one project, work on the next one, and you'll see that they help and inform each other as well. For myself.
Yeah, I think I agree. And also part of that for me is like, if I am burnt out, it's okay to just like not create for a while. So I think when I first started processing Moonlight Sonata, I was like, okay, this is a finite piece of music that was written hundreds of years ago. There's no way that this will like extend on beyond a handful of months. And then I kind of got bored and did some other stuff and got burnt out and started another like degree and all of these things. So I'm still processing Moonlight Sonata like years later, and it's, yes, going to be a finite project, but like accepting that finite doesn't mean like you'll be done this in 2 months, just like you'll be done it when you're done, has felt comforting, maybe is the word that I'm looking for, that like your creativity will come back someday.
I've had a really like similar experience to that, especially through the pandemic. Just general lack of inspiration for what feels like too playful or over serious poetry. So that's kind of ruled out my casual visual poetry thing and my very serious text-based work. But that has opened up space to make these books. And you know, dealing with printers and setting up the pre-sale and all that sort of stuff, it took a lot of time that I don't think I would have taken for myself had I been like all systems go on my creative practice. I was starting to feel like, you know, I got to get something cooking, so maybe I'll get this book made. Well, I have you here. I want to show you the other book that the Blasted Tree did. It's called Without Form. It's a 766-page hardcover. That's an erasure of the entire Holy Bible, leaving like only the chapter and verse notation. So just the floating little numbers, and it goes all the way through the Old and New Testaments. It's just a thing of beauty. This is something that I've been working on with Ben, the author, Ben Robinson, for years. Like, we put out a chapbook of each of the books in the Bible separately, and like, it felt awesome to have it finished, but both of us kind of looked at each other and we're like, so are we going to make a book or what, right? And it took this sort of lull in creativity in the pandemic, the sort of social lull of being with people all the time, to be like, I need to find a way to get connected again, to get connected with people, and making these books was the way to do that. I see what we're like, just kind of coming across our hour-long mark here. And I feel like it's probably a good opportunity to thank everybody who backed the pre-sale, who has like supported the Blasted Tree over the last 7 years. It's been like quite an epic journey. We've made like thousands of pieces of print ephemera at this point. I don't have any grant funding. I don't have any like support from the government. Most publishers aren't able to function without that sort of without that model. And I'm super grateful because I have you. I have just a wonderful community that has shown me nothing but love and support. And every time I sort of question myself, I have like 10 people behind me like, no, keep going. And it's a very incredibly rewarding journey to be on. And I just want to thank all of you for being a part of it. Yeah, this is awkward because if we were in a big room together, I could like clap for you and we'd all clap together and feel really nice. So instead, I'm just going to do that and be like, I couldn't do what I do without all of you. So thank you.
Yeah.